Hello, my name is Sherlock Holmes, and every story hides a truth. Welcome to my new mystery.
The hour was late, the rain unrelenting, and the streets below Baker Street gleamed with the slick reflections of carriage lamps and hurried silhouettes. I had been half dozing in my chair before the fire when the bell sounded, sharp, urgent, and unmistakably desperate. Holmes did not look up from his violin, the bow poised like an extension of his thought. He merely murmured, "A visitor, Watson. Judging by the hour and the rhythm of that ring, I'd wager it is neither a constable nor a client of leisure." Before I could reply, Mrs. Hudson's hesitant voice carried up the stairs. "A lady to see you, Mr. Holmes. Says it's a matter of life and death." Holmes laid down the violin with that curious composure that precedes his most brilliant moments. "Do show her in, Mrs. Hudson," he said calmly. "And fetch a bit more coal. This may be a long night." Moments later, the door opened to reveal a woman wrapped in a dark velvet cloak, its hem glistening with rain. Her face was pale beneath the brim of her hat, eyes wide, not merely with fear but with the haunting certainty of someone pursued by fate. She carried a small leather case clutched to her chest, and her hands trembled slightly as she crossed the threshold. Holmes rose politely. "Pray take the chair by the fire, madam. You are drenched. Allow me to offer some warmth before we discuss the nature of your visit." "Thank you," she whispered, lowering her hood. The firelight fell upon features of refinement, not beautiful in the common sense, but strikingly intelligent even in distress. "My name is Lady Clara Farnsworth. You may have heard of my husband, Lord Henry Farnsworth." "I recall the name," Holmes replied, settling opposite her. "Philanthropist, patron of the arts, and a rather notorious collector of oddities. But forgive me, Lady Farnsworth. Your expression suggests this is not a social call." She swallowed hard and opened the small case. Inside lay a single crimson glove, silk finely stitched, and stained along the fingertips with what could only be blood. "I found this," she said quietly, "beside the body of a man outside my home this evening. A man I swear I have never seen before." Holmes leaned forward, his gaze sharp as a blade. "And yet your monogram is upon it," she gasped. "You know?" He gestured to the delicate embroidery near the wrist, the faint but unmistakable letters CF. "It is difficult to miss. You are certain, Lady Farnsworth, that this glove was not yours?" "Quite certain. I own many pairs of crimson gloves, yes, a fashionable affectation perhaps, but this one is different. The stitching, the fabric. It is mine and yet not mine. I had never worn it." Holmes's eyes glittered with interest. "You speak paradoxically, madam. A contradiction that invites explanation." Her voice trembled. "There was a ball tonight at Lord Winter's estate. I returned home early as I felt unwell. My husband remained behind. As I stepped from the carriage, my driver noticed something lying by the gate. That glove. And near it the body of a man. I screamed for help, of course, but when the constable arrived, he said the poor soul had been dead for hours. They think—" She faltered, her composure cracking. "They think I lured him there." Holmes steepled his fingers. "And your husband?" "He has not returned, nor has he sent word." At this, Holmes's gaze sharpened still further. "Watson, the lantern and my coat, if you please. Lady Farnsworth, where precisely did you find the body?" "In Grosvenor Square," she said faintly. "By the eastern gate." Within minutes we were on our way, the handsome carriage cutting through the mist-drenched streets. Lady Farnsworth sat opposite us, her eyes fixed on the crimson glove resting in Holmes's gloved hand. He studied it under the flickering lamplight, his lips moving soundlessly as though reciting invisible equations. At last he spoke. "Note, Watson, the peculiar scent. Not perfume, something industrial. Perhaps a solvent or dye compound." I leaned closer and detected it. A faint metallic tang mingled with something sweet, almost floral. "Odd, I can't place it." "Nor can most men," Holmes replied, "which is precisely why it interests me." We arrived at Grosvenor Square to find the constable still keeping watch. The body lay near the gate, covered by a sheet that the rain had turned translucent. Holmes crouched, lifting one corner carefully. The man beneath was of middle years, well-dressed but plainly so, with features oddly peaceful despite the pallor of death. "There's no wound," I observed, kneeling beside him. "No sign of struggle either." Holmes nodded. "And yet the fingertips are stained red, not blood but dye. The same dye, I suspect, as upon the glove." He examined the man's pockets, withdrawing a handkerchief marked with a small crest, a mask surrounded by laurel leaves. Ah, the symbol of the Royal Lyceum Theatre. A curious place for a man of this bearing to find employment. He rose and turned to the constable. The body has not been moved? No, sir. Just as we found him. Holmes's gaze traveled over the cobblestones, the puddles, the faint reflection of lamplight. Watson, what do you observe about the ground beneath him? I looked closer. It's perfectly dry. Precisely. Holmes's voice was low, measured. This man did not die here. He was placed here on after death, and the absence of blood confirms it. Yet the glove was dropped deliberately, positioned just so, where Lady Farnsworth would be certain to find it. Lady Farnsworth shuddered. You mean to say someone wished to implicate me? I mean to say, Holmes replied, that someone wished to draw attention to you. The glove was not a mistake. It was an introduction. He straightened suddenly, eyes gleaming. Watson, do you recall the case of the opera cloak mystery some years ago? The use of theatrical costume to disguise evidence? I nodded. You think this connected to the theater? Holmes smiled faintly. The dead man's handkerchief suggests as much. But more than that, the dye. A stage pigment, I believe, of a specific and costly kind, used to stain silk or leather for dramatic effect. We shall confirm this tomorrow at the Lyceum. As we escorted Lady Farnsworth back to her carriage, she turned to Holmes, her composure cracking once more. Mr. Holmes, do you truly believe I am in danger? Holmes looked at her with unusual gentleness. I believe, madam, that danger has already introduced itself at your doorstep. Whether it chooses to enter depends upon what you choose to tell me when next we meet. Her lips parted as if to protest, but he was already turning away, his coat collar high against the wind. When we returned to Baker Street, dawn was bleeding faintly over the rooftops. Holmes stood at the window, pipe in hand, his silhouette etched against the gray light. There is something almost artistic about it, Watson, he murmured. A crimson glove, a body without blood, and a woman whose guilt is written by another's hand. Whoever staged this scene did so with theatrical precision, and where there is theater, there is motive. Vanity, jealousy, revenge. The stage is never far from murder. He turned toward me, his eyes bright with the thrill of pursuit. Sleep if you can, my dear fellow. Tomorrow we go to the theater, where the curtain may rise on something far darker than any play. The fire crackled softly. Outside, London stirred beneath its blanket of rain, unaware that somewhere between the gaslights and the velvet shadows, a crimson glove had already begun to weave its sinister tale. The morning that followed was gray and brittle, the kind of London morning where even the air seems reluctant to stir. I awoke to find Holmes already at work, his breakfast untouched, his gaze fixed on a narrow glass vial filled with crimson-tinted residue. The laboratory table was crowded with flasks, swatches of silk, and the glove Lady Farnsworth had left in our care. He greeted me without looking up. Good morning, Watson. I trust you slept soundly while I conversed with the ghosts of the theater. Barely soundly, I replied, rubbing my eyes. You've been at it since dawn, I presume. What have you discovered? Holmes held the vial to the light. Confirmation of my suspicions. The stain upon the glove is not blood, but a pigment known as carmine oxide, used by theatrical costumers for tinting silk and leather. It is rare, expensive, and imported from France. The last shipment, according to my notes, was purchased by a Mr. Basil Torrance, proprietor of the Royal Lyceum Theatre. The same name embroidered on the handkerchief we found upon the body. I said, precisely. Holmes allowed himself a faint smile. It seems our path is set, Watson. The stage calls for its audience. We arrived at the Lyceum just as the first chill drizzle of the morning began to fall. The theater loomed over the street, all columns, arches, and the faint scent of old velvet and grease paint lingering even outside. Within, the grand lobby echoed with the hollow sound of our footsteps. A sleepy doorman in a threadbare waistcoat eyed us with suspicion until Holmes presented his calling card. Mr. Torrance is not receiving visitors. Sir, the man said. I rather think he shall make an exception, Holmes replied, brushing past with the quiet authority of a man accustomed to obedience. Watson, do take note. Resistance is the first refuge of guilt. The doorman muttered an apology and hurried off, leaving us to wander through the vast, dimly lit auditorium. The air carried the faint scent of sawdust and old perfumes. On the stage, a group of laborers were dismantling a set, painted columns and papier-mâché statues of Grecian gods. Holmes's gaze swept over the scene with almost theatrical appreciation. "Observe, Watson. The stage, like life, conceals its secrets behind careful artifice." A voice echoed from the wings. "And sometimes behind men who talk too much." A tall, angular figure emerged from the shadows, Mr. Basil Torrance himself. His face was pale, his expression sharp and guarded, his hand stained faintly with paint. "I assume you're the gentleman from Baker Street," he said dryly. "Your reputation precedes you. To what do I owe the pleasure?" Holmes's tone was cordial but cutting. "To a dead man, Mr. Torrance, one whose handkerchief bore your insignia. He was found last night in Grosvenor Square." For a moment, Torrance's mask slipped. His lips tightened, his eyes flickered. Then, recovering, he said, "An unfortunate coincidence. I employ many stagehands and craftsmen. Perhaps one of them met with some misadventure." "Perhaps," Holmes said mildly, "though the dye upon his fingertips matches that used here, and the glove found beside him was tinted in precisely the same batch." Torrance's jaw clenched. "That is impossible." "Nothing is impossible, Mr. Torrance. Improbable, perhaps, but seldom impossible." Holmes stepped closer, lowering his voice. "You were acquainted with Lady Farnsworth." Torrance blinked. "I know of her, naturally. She attends our performances. A patron of the arts, I believe." "Indeed," Holmes said softly. "And yet your accounts show a commission. A private costume, crimson silk, ordered under her name but paid for by another." "Lord Henry Farnsworth," Torrance hesitated. "I fail to see how," Holmes interrupted. "The commission included gloves. 2 pairs to be precise. 1 delivered, 1 retained. And the craftsman who sewed them, your costumer, Elias Reeve, vanished 1 week ago." At the name, a shadow crossed Torrance's face. He turned away, his hand tightening on the back of a chair. Elias left suddenly. He was troubled, fancied himself pursued. "I thought it best not to interfere." Holmes's eyes narrowed. A convenient philosophy for a man who profits from silence. I could see Torrance's composure beginning to fray. His hands fidgeted, his voice trembled slightly. "You accuse me of what, precisely? Murder? Theft? You have no proof." Holmes's reply was calm, almost gentle. "Not yet. But proof, Mr. Torrance, is the one commodity I never fail to acquire. The question is whether I shall find it here, or upon the next corpse." Torrance's eyes flicked toward the stage door, then back. "You have no right. I have the right of reason," Holmes said quietly. "And reason tells me you are concealing something." For a moment neither spoke. The only sound was the faint echo of hammers in the distance. Then Torrance sighed, the fight draining from his shoulders. "There was a quarrel," he admitted at last, "between Elias Reeve and Lord Farnsworth. The nobleman commissioned a special piece, a costume for a private masquerade, I believe. But when Reeve refused to modify it as requested, tempers flared. Farnsworth struck him. 2 days later, Reeve disappeared. I feared scandal. I said nothing. Holmes exchanged a glance with me. "And the glove?" Torrance hesitated. "It was part of the costume. The Crimson Phantom, Reeve called it. A role meant for some private performance. The dye used for the gloves was unstable and it left stains. When Reeve vanished, the second pair went missing from the workshop." Holmes's expression grew thoughtful. "And you never reported this?" "To whom, Mr. Holmes?" "To the police, who would accuse me of forgery. To Lord Farnsworth, who would ruin me for speaking his name." I chose silence. Holmes regarded him for a long moment, then turned to me. "Watson, make a note. Carmine oxide, unstable dye associated with the costume named the Crimson Phantom. It seems our dead man may have worn more than just another man's glove." Torrance bristled. "You think the murdered man was Elias?" Holmes shrugged. "That remains to be seen. But if so, his death was not without audience." We left the theater with the echo of Torrance's nervous voice fading behind us. Outside, the drizzle had turned to rain once more, the streets glistening beneath the lamps. Holmes walked in silence for several minutes before speaking. "Consider, Watson, a nobleman commissions a costume. The costumer vanishes. The glove reappears beside a dead man outside the nobleman's home, bearing the lady's initials. Every element theatrical, every gesture deliberate. We are watching a play on one written by an unseen hand." "And Lady Farnsworth?" I asked. "Do you think she knows more than she admits?" "Knowledge, my dear Watson, is not always awareness," Holmes said. There are those who play their parts without knowing the script. But Lord Farnsworth, he is another matter. He hailed a cab, giving the driver an address in Mayfair. The husband has remained conspicuously absent. I propose we call upon him next. As the carriage rattled through the wet streets, I could not shake the image of the crimson glove, so bright, so deliberate, its stain spreading like quiet accusation across everything it touched. When we reached the Farnsworth residence, the butler received us with visible unease. "My lord is indisposed," he said. Holmes's eyes glinted. "Indisposed or unavailable?" The butler hesitated, then stepped aside. "He has not been seen since last night, sir." The servants assumed he stayed the night at Lord Winter's. "Assume nothing," Holmes said curtly. "Lead us to his study." The room was dark, curtains drawn. A faint scent of tobacco lingered in the air, mingled with something sharper, chemical, acrid. Holmes crossed to the desk, rifling through papers, pausing over a small mahogany box. Inside lay several glass vials, each labeled with a different pigment compound and one bearing the same name, carmine oxide. Holmes's expression hardened. So the Lord dabbled in chemistry. Curious hobby for a man of leisure. I opened a nearby drawer and froze. "Holmes," I said quietly, "look at this." Inside lay a folded scrap of crimson silk, and beneath it a torn piece of parchment with a sketch of a glove, annotated in neat handwriting. Across the bottom, 2 words stood out in dark ink: "For the masquerade." Holmes studied the drawing, his brow furrowed. "It seems our Lord sought to craft not merely a costume, but a persona. The Crimson Phantom, a figure of legend perhaps. No, something more. Vanity and theater intertwined. And somewhere in that blend lies murder." He closed the drawer softly. "Watson, the pattern is forming. A craftsman betrayed, a nobleman disgraced, and a lady caught between them. The blood may not stain the cobblestones, but it clings nonetheless, to silk, to pride, and to the hands that made them both." He turned toward the door, his expression sharpened by purpose. "We shall call upon Lady Farnsworth once more. It is time she told us what role her husband truly played in this drama." And as we stepped back into the rain, the crimson-stained glove, now sealed in Holmes's case, seemed almost to pulse faintly beneath the lamplight, as though some part of the story still beat within it, waiting to be revealed. The rain had thickened by the time Holmes and I returned to Baker Street, the air filled with a dull hiss as if London itself were whispering secrets too faint to hear. Holmes said little during the cab ride, his gaze fixed beyond the window where the gaslights shimmered and distorted in the wet glass. I knew that look. His mind was building a pattern, weaving invisible threads between each fragment of evidence. When we finally reached the warmth of our rooms, he lit the fire, then stood motionless before it, the flames painting restless shapes upon his sharp features. "Watson," he said at last, "the pattern grows darker but clearer. Our noble Lord Farnsworth is missing. The craftsman is dead, and the glove, and that cursed piece of vanity, is at the heart of both. Yet there is a third hand guiding this performance, unseen but deliberate." I poured him a cup of tea, though I knew he would not touch it. "You think someone is orchestrating all of this?" "Not think, Watson, no." He began to pace. "Every move has been calculated. The die, the masquerade, the theatrics, all too neatly contrived to be random. We are not dealing with a crime of passion, but one of presentation. Our killer understands drama." "The theater again," I said quietly. "Precisely." His eyes flared with sudden light. "And what better stage for deception than one already filled with artifice? I should like to pay another visit to the Lyceum, though this time not as an audience." Within the hour, we stood once more before the great doors of the theater, now shrouded in twilight mist. Inside, the main hall was empty save for the distant echo of a piano. Holmes moved with practiced stealth, his lantern beam cutting through the gloom as we slipped behind the curtains and descended into the labyrinth beneath the stage. It was a world unseen by the public, a maze of ropes, pulleys, discarded costumes, and mirrors veiled in dust. The scent of old velvet and turpentine hung thick in the air. Holmes crouched near a wooden trunk marked Elias Reeve, props. He pried it open with a swift motion. Inside lay a jumble of sketches, fabric swatches, and tools. Among them, a notebook bound in cracked leather. Holmes flipped through it, his eyes narrowing. "Watson, look here. Notes on glove patterns, dye mixtures, and something else." He held the book to the light. Scrawled across one page were the words, "He knows. I must hide the second glove." Beneath it a sketch of a mask, long, angular, and disturbingly blank. "The second glove?" I asked. "Then one still remains." Holmes nodded grimly. "And likely with the killer. The question is, and who wears it now?" A sound interrupted us. Soft footsteps on the boards above, slow, deliberate. Holmes gestured for silence, extinguishing the lantern. We listened. The faint light from a trapdoor overhead spilled down in pale stripes. A shadow passed across it. Tall, slender, and unmistakably cautious. Holmes whispered, "Stay here, Watson." Then with feline precision, he ascended the narrow stairway, vanishing into the dark. For several minutes I waited, hearing only the creak of wood and the distant rumble of the street outside. Then came a muffled sound, a sharp intake of breath followed by the scrape of something metallic. Instinct overruled caution. I climbed after him. I emerged behind the stage where the curtains hung like the wings of some great sleeping beast. There, under the dim glow of a single lamp, Holmes stood face to face with Basil Torrance. The theater owner's expression was wild, desperate, and in his right hand gleamed a small revolver. "I warned you, Holmes," Torrance hissed. "You should have stayed away from this place." Holmes was perfectly still, his voice calm but cutting. "Guilt, Mr. Torrance, is a poor disguise, especially when it shakes the hand that holds the gun." "You think me guilty?" Torrance's voice cracked. "You know nothing. You meddle in things beyond your comprehension. That costume and that glove, it wasn't meant for me or for Farnsworth. It was his creation, Elias's madness." Holmes tilted his head. "Madness, you say? And yet you profited from it well enough. Tell me, where is the other glove?" Torrance's hand trembled. "I burned it. After I found him, after the quarrel. He came here that night, raving, covered in that cursed dye. Said the glove had marked him, that it whispered to him. I thought he was drunk. Then he struck me and fled. When I went after him, he was gone." "Gone where?" "I don't know." Torrance's voice rose, echoing off the empty rafters. "But you'll not hang me for his ghost." Before Holmes could move, Torrance fired. The shot shattered the silence, punching through the drapery beside Holmes's shoulder. I ducked instinctively as Holmes sprang forward, wrenching the weapon from the trembling man's hand. Torrance crumpled to his knees, sobbing, the gun clattering across the stage. Holmes examined the weapon briefly, then handed it to me. "Empty your theater of shadows, Torrance," he said coldly. "You are no murderer, but you are a coward, one who stood by while another man bled for your deceit." Torrance buried his face in his hands. "You don't understand. It wasn't just a costume. He wanted to make it real, to make the Crimson Phantom more than a performance. Said it would outlive the stage, said it needed blood to bind it." Holmes's expression darkened. "Superstition, perhaps, but sometimes belief itself can kill." At that moment, a door slammed somewhere above and footsteps echoed down the corridor. Holmes stiffened, signaling for silence. The footsteps approached, firm, deliberate, and unmistakably those of a man accustomed to command. Out of the gloom stepped Lord Farnsworth. His face was drawn, pale as wax, yet his eyes glittered with defiant calm. "Mr. Holmes," he said, his tone smooth as polished marble. "I had hoped our acquaintance would remain purely social." Holmes gave a slight bow. "And yet fate draws us back to your stage, my lord. How fitting." Farnsworth's gaze flicked to Torrance, who sat trembling. "I see you've found my wayward friend. I trust he's been entertaining." "Most enlightening," Holmes replied, "though his tale lacks one crucial act, your part in this performance." Farnsworth's lips curved in a faint smile. "My part? I merely commissioned art, not murder. What Reeve chose to do with his delusions was his own affair." Holmes stepped closer, eyes sharp. "And yet his death occurred within sight of your home. His glove, your wife's initials. His dye, in your possession. The pattern is far too precise to be coincidence." For a moment, Farnsworth's composure wavered. Then he sighed. "You are clever, Holmes, but not clever enough. The world is built on illusion. We who understand that simply use it better than others." He turned toward the wings, and I caught the faint gleam of crimson at his wrist, a flash of silk beneath his cuff. "Holmes," I began, but Holmes was already moving. In a single stride, he seized Farnsworth's arm and tore back the sleeve. There it was, the missing glove, bright and terrible in the lamplight, its dye seeping faintly into his skin like blood through linen. Farnsworth laughed softly, though the sound trembled. "You see? It doesn't wash away. He was right, you know. The color binds itself to flesh, a mark of creation and of guilt. Tainted by your own vanity, Holmes said coldly. You used the craftsman's devotion to your art against him, and when he defied you, you silenced him. I elevated him, Farnsworth snapped. He died for something magnificent. Holmes's eyes hardened. He died for your ego. Before another word could pass, Torrance leapt to his feet. You said you burned it, he screamed, pointing at the glove. You swore it was gone. Farnsworth's face twisted. I did what I must. The masquerade had to go on. Holmes took a step back, his voice low and final. And it shall, my lord. In a courtroom. The scene dissolved into chaos. Torrance sobbing. Farnsworth struggling as I restrained him. And Holmes silent amid the storm, his gaze fixed upon the crimson glove that gleamed like a wound against pale skin. When at last we turned him over to the constables, the rain had ceased. The city lay still, wrapped in the faint mist of dawn. Holmes stood at the curb, watching as the carriage rolled away. You see, Watson, he murmured, some men crave immortality so deeply they will stain their souls to achieve it. But fame, like dye, is a fragile thing. It fades, yet the stain remains. And as the first light touched the theater's fading sign, the word Lyceum shimmered briefly as though mocking us all, a reminder that every stage, no matter how grand, hides a darker play behind the curtain. The morning after Lord Farnsworth's arrest dawned gray and hollow, the fog lingering over Baker Street like the ghost of the night before. I found Holmes at his desk, the crimson glove laid before him under a glass dome. It looked strangely lifeless in the daylight, its color dulled to a deep maroon, but something in it still unsettled me, as though it remembered the hand that had worn it. Holmes sat motionless, fingers steepled beneath his chin, eyes fixed upon that relic with an intensity that seemed to burn through the glass. His breakfast sat untouched. The pipe smoke wove upward in lazy spirals, the air heavy with the scent of contemplation. You've not slept, I said quietly. He did not look up. Sleep, Watson, is an indulgence afforded to men with duller mysteries than this. Tell me, when you saw Farnsworth in that glove, did it strike you as the act of a desperate man or of a man possessed? Both, perhaps, I replied. He spoke of it as if it had power. Holmes's lips curved faintly. Ah, yes, power in that convenient veil behind which all vanity hides. But what if it was not vanity alone that drove him? I frowned. You believe something more was at work? Holmes leaned forward, his voice low, measured. When I removed that glove, Farnsworth's hand bore marks, went faint but unmistakable. A discoloration beneath the skin, as though the dye had sunk into the very flesh. The composition of carmine oxide should not produce such an effect. You suspect poison? Or perhaps intention? He rose suddenly, retrieving his magnifier and bending over the dome. This glove was no mere costume piece. It was altered, treated with an unknown compound. I mean to learn what? He began his analysis, methodical as always, crushing small fragments of the stained fabric into a vial of reagent. The liquid frothed faintly, releasing a sharp metallic scent. Holmes's eyes lit with that familiar gleam of triumph. Interesting. Mercury nitrate, a mordant used for fixing dyes permanently to silk. Rare, and dangerously toxic in prolonged contact with the skin. He straightened, the excitement in his voice edged with gravity. Reeve was experimenting with it. He must have known the risks. Then Farnsworth's so-called mark of creation was poisoning him? Precisely. He wore his own undoing. Holmes turned away, gazing out the window where the fog swirled like a living thing. But this discovery raises a new question. Who supplied Reeve with the chemical? A theater costumer has no access to such material. Someone else had a hand in this design. Before I could reply, a knock sounded at the door, hesitant, uneven. Mrs. Hudson's voice followed, troubled. It's a messenger, Mr. Holmes, says it's urgent. A boy stepped in, no older than 15, soaked through from the rain. He handed Holmes a folded note, his eyes wide and frightened. The man said to bring this to you right away, sir. Said it's about the glove. Holmes broke the seal and scanned the paper. His brows drew together. From Inspector Lestrade. Farnsworth has escaped custody. Escaped? I exclaimed. Impossible. Nothing is impossible when fear takes the reins, Holmes muttered. The coach carrying him to Newgate was intercepted at the corner of Holborn. 2 guards rendered unconscious went in with chloroform. He folded the note, slipping it into his coat. Watson, we are dealing with a mind not yet finished with its performance. Farnsworth was vain, yes, but not reckless. He had help. We left Baker Street at once, the cab wheels slicing through puddles as the city passed in muted gray tones. Holmes was silent, lost in thought, until at last he said, "There is a curious symmetry to this affair. A craftsman slain for his creation, a patron poisoned by his pride, and now an unseen hand manipulating both. Tell me, Watson, what better stage than a city of shadows?" By the time we reached Scotland Yard, Lestrade was pacing the floor, his mustache bristling with irritation. "Blasted clever devil," he barked as we entered. We'd just reached the Old Bailey when the coachman collapsed. When my men came to, Farnsworth was gone. "Describe the scene," Holmes said curtly. Drivers slumped over the reins, both guards unconscious. No signs of struggle. Found this on the ground. He held up a handkerchief, white linen embroidered with a single crimson thread in the corner. Holmes examined it closely, his eyes narrowing. "Same thread as the glove. The pigment's identical." Lestrade frowned. "You think someone's taunting us?" "I think someone's finishing their act," Holmes replied. "This was no rescue, Lestrade. It was a retrieval. Farnsworth has outlived his purpose." "Then where would they take him?" I asked. Holmes's gaze turned distant. "Somewhere fitting. Somewhere theatrical." It was nearly dusk when Holmes's search brought us back to the East End, to a derelict warehouse that had once stored stage props for the Lyceum. The building loomed at the edge of the Thames, its windows boarded, its reflection trembling in the dark water below. Holmes motioned for silence as we slipped inside. The air was heavy with damp and rot. Somewhere in the distance a low moan echoed, faint, human. We followed the sound to a small room at the rear, where a single lantern flickered on a table. And there, bound to a chair, sat Lord Farnsworth. He was alive, barely. His face was ashen, his eyes glassy, his right hand bare and swollen, the skin discolored in a terrible shade between crimson and violet. Holmes knelt beside him, his voice steady. "You've been poisoned by your own vanity, my lord. Tell me, who helped you escape?" Farnsworth's lips moved, barely audible. "The hand." Holmes leaned closer. "What hand?" "The hand that vanished. He said he'd finish it." Farnsworth's eyes darted wildly as though seeing something in the shadows. "Reeve, he's not dead?" His body convulsed and then went still. For a moment there was only the sound of the river outside and the hiss of the dying lantern. Holmes rose slowly, his face unreadable. "He's gone." I felt a chill crawl down my spine. "But he said, I heard." Holmes turned toward the table. There beside the lantern lay a hand. Not severed, but sculpted, wax painted perfectly lifelike. A mirror of Farnsworth's own. Its palm bore a faint red imprint, as if pressed there by a bloodied glove. Holmes examined it, his expression grave. A message. Or perhaps a signature. The lantern sputtered out, plunging us into near darkness. Holmes struck a match, his face illuminated in the brief flare of light. "Watson, this case is no longer merely about murder. Someone is reviving Elias Reeve's design. And if Farnsworth was the actor, then his killer is the playwright." He pocketed the wax hand, his tone low and grim. "The hand that vanished, Watson. It did not vanish by chance. It was taken to be remade. This is only the second act." As we stepped back into the fog, the warehouse behind us seemed to breathe, the faint echo of the river whispering through its hollow windows. Somewhere unseen, the true creator watched, waiting for his curtain to rise once more. The fog that clung to the river that night seemed unwilling to lift, as if London itself wished to conceal what we had found within that warehouse. Holmes and I returned to Baker Street in silence, the rattle of the cab wheels over the stones marking time like a slow, funereal drum. He sat opposite me, the wax hand resting in a small wooden box on his lap. He never once looked away from it. When we arrived, he placed the box upon the table with almost ceremonial care, then began pacing before the fire. "Watson," he said at last, "what do you see when you look at that object?" I approached it, studying the hand in the lamplight. A model skillfully made. It could easily be mistaken for the real thing, were it not for the chill of wax. "Precisely," Holmes murmured. "Every vein, every pore, reproduced with unnatural fidelity. Yet look here." He drew my attention to the wrist where the wax met a faint ring of hardened plaster. The impression was taken from a living hand, not a corpse. The plaster bears the texture of warm skin, the subtle irregularities that disappear upon death. Then someone cast this from Farnsworth before he died? Holmes's eyes glittered. Or from another subject entirely. The question is who? He reached for his chemical kit, slicing a sliver from the wax and placing it into a vial. As he applied heat, a faint aroma filled the room, something between turpentine and bitter almonds. Holmes stiffened. Watson, do you detect it? Some kind of solvent? More than that. Venetian turpentine, used by painters to mix with oil pigments. This wax hand was not made by a sculptor, but by a painter accustomed to preparing his own varnishes. Our phantom playwright, it seems, is an artist of more than one medium. He strode to his files and withdrew a folder labeled Artists of the Theatrical Circle, 1885. Flipping rapidly through the sheets, he stopped at one and held it toward me. Victor Elridge, portraitist, scenographer, and known associate of Elias Reeve. He vanished from the public eye 2 years ago, following a scandal involving a forged commission for the Royal Academy. His reputation destroyed, his name forgotten, and now perhaps reborn. You believe Elridge is behind this? Holmes did not answer immediately. He struck a match, lighting his pipe, and began to pace again, the smoke curling about his sharp features like mist around a cliff face. Elridge studied under Reeve. He would have known the process Reeve developed, his obsession with lifelike representation. If Reeve was murdered for that knowledge, Elridge would have every reason to reclaim it, perhaps even improve upon it. He turned toward the window, his silhouette framed against the dim orange glow of gaslight from the street below. Watson, do you recall Farnsworth's mention of the Theater of Shadows? It was Elridge who designed its backdrops before it closed. Then that warehouse wasn't just a hiding place, I realized. It was one of his old studios. Exactly. And I suspect another still exists, the main atelier where he perfected his technique. We shall find it. The next day found us in the narrow lanes of Clerkenwell, where the air smelled of varnish, old wood, and oil. Holmes's inquiries led us to a derelict row of buildings that once served as workshops for stage designers. Most were boarded up, but one bore fresh paint around the hinges, a subtle sign of recent use. Holmes pressed a gloved hand to the lock, examined the faint scratches, and smiled. Crude workmanship. Whoever closed this door was in haste. He produced his pick, and within seconds the bolt gave way. Inside, dust motes danced in slanted beams of morning light. Canvases leaned against every wall, their subjects half finished, faces emerging from shadow, hands reaching outward as though alive. The room reeked of turpentine and despair. Holmes moved methodically, inspecting each piece. I followed, struck by the uncanny life-likeness of the painted eyes. It felt as if the portraits watched us in silence. Then, in the far corner, Holmes stopped before a large canvas covered by a cloth. With a single motion, he tore it away. I gasped. It was a portrait of Lord Farnsworth, or rather of his corpse. The pallor, the swollen veins, the faint discoloration of the poisoned hand. Every detail rendered with dreadful precision. Holmes's jaw tightened. Painted after death, Elridge immortalized his victim. The hand that vanished indeed, only to reappear here, trapped forever in pigment. He stepped closer, examining the brushwork. Notice the layering. He used a drying medium that accelerates hardening. This was completed recently, within the last 48 hours. A sound interrupted him, the soft creak of a floorboard above. Holmes's eyes flicked upward. We are not alone. He motioned for silence and moved swiftly toward the stairs, his revolver drawn. I followed, heart pounding. The upper floor was dim, lit only by the faint gray of daylight through a broken skylight. At the far end of the room, a figure stood before an easel, motionless, painting. Victor Elridge, Holmes said sharply. The man did not turn. His voice, when it came, was soft and distant. I wondered when you would find me, Mr. Holmes. The glove told you, I imagine. It did, Holmes replied evenly. And the wax hand confirmed it. You've taken your master's work and turned it into an instrument of death. Elridge lowered his brush at last and turned. His face was gaunt, his eyes fever-bright. Reeve's work was never understood. He sought truth through art, the perfection of form, the eternal preservation of beauty. I only continued what he began. By murdering your patrons, I demanded. He smiled faintly. You call it murder. I call it preservation. Their vanity, their corruption, captured forever before decay could claim them. The glove was only the first step, a catalyst. The mercury cured the flesh into stillness. A living statue. Holmes's gaze hardened. And Farnsworth? He begged to become immortal, Elridge said simply. I obliged. Holmes took a slow step forward. And yet you fled. Why hide if you believe your work righteous? Elridge's hands trembled. Because the hand failed. The poison spread too quickly. The flesh blackened, but imperfect. I must begin again. He reached for something beneath the easel, a covered frame. When he pulled away the cloth, I felt the blood drain from my face. It was a new portrait. Unfinished, but unmistakably Holmes. The same hawk-like eyes, the sharp lines of his profile rendered in delicate strokes. You've been watching me, Holmes said quietly. Elridge nodded. You are the final subject. The mind that sees beyond illusion. I shall paint you as you truly are, before the fire in your intellect burns out. Holmes's revolver leveled. That will not happen, Mr. Elridge. But the painter only laughed, a sound thin as breaking glass. Then with sudden fury he hurled a vial of liquid at the floor. The fumes filled the air instantly, acrid and blinding. When I could see again, he was gone. The skylight above shattered, the cold wind howling through. Holmes coughed, covering his mouth with a handkerchief. Quick, Watson, outside! We stumbled into the street, the smoke trailing after us. By the time we emerged, there was no sign of Elridge. Only a carriage disappearing into the fog toward the river. Holmes watched it vanish, his expression unreadable. He intends to finish his masterpiece, Watson. But he will not do so alone. The painter's secret lies not in his art, but in his next subject. And I fear I know who that may be. He turned to me then, his voice low. He needs a mind to immortalize, one he deems worthy. And there is only one other who shared his obsession with Reeves' work. I stared at him, realization dawning slowly. You mean? Yes, Holmes said grimly. Elias Reeves' widow, the woman who vanished the night her husband died. We must find her before Elridge does, or the curtain will fall on a masterpiece written in blood. The following evening, Baker Street was shrouded in a tense quiet. Rain whispered against the windows, a soft, persistent tapping like the fingers of fate itself. Holmes stood by the hearth, the flickering firelight outlining his gaunt features and casting long, restless shadows on the wall. He had not spoken in nearly an hour, yet his mind, I knew, was alight with furious calculation. The open box containing the wax hand still rested upon the mantelpiece, beside it a single crimson glove, now sealed in glass. It gleamed faintly as if still wet. Holmes finally turned toward me. Watson, he said in a low tone, Elridge has made his next move. I have been in correspondence with Inspector Lestrade. A new exhibition opens tonight at the Royal Crescent Hall. The Masquerade of Forms, a charitable gala attended by London's elite. Among the contributors, a recently reinstated portraitist using the pseudonym V.E. Elridge, I breathed. He inclined his head. Precisely. He has resurfaced in plain sight, beneath a veneer of legitimacy. And what better stage for deception than a masquerade? Masks conceal not only faces, Watson, but intentions. He moved to his desk where a folded letter lay. This arrived an hour ago. It bears no signature. He handed it to me. The writing was elegant but trembling slightly, as if penned in haste. He seeks her beneath the masks. The widow shall not see the dawn. I looked up sharply. The widow, Reeves' wife? Holmes's eyes met mine, cold and brilliant. Indeed. Elridge intends to complete his masterpiece tonight. We must be there before he does. An hour later, we were in a hansom cab, racing through the fog-choked streets toward Westminster. The city seemed to pulse with unseen menace. The gas lamps glowed like wary eyes through the mist. Holmes, dressed in immaculate evening attire, wore a black half-mask of Venetian design. His every movement carried an air of theatrical detachment, the hunter already among his prey. When we arrived, the Royal Crescent Hall was ablaze with light. Carriages lined the street, their wheels hissing through puddles as masked guests stepped down beneath umbrellas. The air smelled of perfume, champagne, and rain-soaked velvet. Inside, the vast ballroom shimmered with gold and crimson drapery. The music of a waltz floated through the air, mingling with laughter and murmured conversation. Yet beneath the splendor I felt a strange unease, as if the very walls watched us. Holmes leaned toward me, voice low. Stay alert. Elridge is here, of that I am certain. He will not resist the temptation to admire his own performance. We moved through the crowd slowly, scanning faces beneath painted masks. Everywhere I looked there were feathers, jewels, and false smiles. The illusion of beauty was overwhelming, fitting for an artist obsessed with it. Then Holmes's gaze fixed on something across the room. "There," he murmured. Following his line of sight, I saw a woman standing near the grand staircase. She wore a gown of silver silk, her mask adorned with delicate filigree. Yet it was her stillness that caught my attention. She stood apart, her gloved hands clasped tightly as if in fear. "The Widow Reeve," Holmes whispered. "I would stake my reputation upon it." We began to move toward her when a figure intercepted us. Tall, cloaked in midnight blue satin, wearing a full face mask painted like porcelain. The eyes behind it glinted with an unnatural calm. "Mr. Holmes," the figure said softly, "you grace the masquerade after all." "Elridge," Holmes replied evenly. A ripple of tension seemed to pass between them, felt even through the crowd's oblivious gaiety. "You've gone to great lengths for this performance," and Holmes continued. "Yet every act must end." "Where is Mrs. Reeve?" Elridge tilted his head. "Safe, for now. She has agreed to sit for her portrait. The moment must be eternal after all." "She has no such wish," Holmes said sharply. "You deceive yourself as you deceived Farnsworth. Your art is nothing but a distortion of death." The painter's smile beneath the mask was visible only in the faint movement of his jaw. "Death is merely stillness perfected. You, of all men, should appreciate precision." Before Holmes could respond, the orchestra struck a sharp new note, the conductor's baton tapping thrice. The lights dimmed slightly as masked attendants began unveiling new works displayed along the hall's edges. Murmurs rose among the guests, gasps mingled with admiration. Holmes turned and I followed his gaze. At the center of the hall, upon a gilded easel, stood a massive covered frame draped in crimson cloth. Elridge extended a gloved hand toward it. "The culmination of my work. The Crimson Glove, they will call it. Would you do the honor, Mr. Holmes?" The crowd, oblivious to the undercurrent of menace, began to applaud. Holmes's eyes never left Elridge's. Slowly, he stepped forward, his every movement deliberate. He took hold of the cord, and with one swift motion, drew the cloth aside. A cry escaped my lips. It was Mrs. Reeve, or rather, what appeared to be her, seated upon a carved chair, her skin pale as marble, her gown gleaming like wet silk. For a moment I thought it a painting, but then I saw the faint shimmer of moisture at her lips, the slightest tremor of her eyelids. "She's alive," I whispered. Elridge bowed slightly. "Not for long. The process has begun. The fluid renders the flesh rigid while preserving its hue, a masterpiece in transition." Holmes lunged forward, but Elridge moved with serpentine speed, producing a small glass vial from his pocket and holding it aloft. "One more step and she will never wake again." The crowd gasped, finally sensing something amiss. Panic rippled through the hall. Holmes froze, his voice sharp and cold. "You will not escape, Elridge." "Escape?" The painter laughed, a hollow, broken sound. "I have already transcended escape. I am creation itself." He uncorked the vial and flung it toward the floor. Holmes was faster. With a flick of his cane, he struck the glass midair. It shattered harmlessly against a marble pillar. Elridge cursed, drawing a small dagger from beneath his cloak. The music dissolved into chaos when screams, shattering glass, the pounding of feet. Holmes darted forward, seizing his wrist, and the two men struggled amidst a storm of masks and panic. I rushed to Mrs. Reeve, feeling her pulse. It was faint, fluttering, but alive. I found the scent of almonds upon her breath and knew it. Mercury poisoning. I tore away her gloves, revealing the telltale pallor beneath her nails. Holmes and Elridge crashed against the table, sending goblets and candles flying. Elridge fought with the desperation of a man cornered by his own madness. "You cannot destroy perfection," he hissed, his blade slashing wildly. Holmes twisted his arm, forcing him down. "Perfection dies the moment it takes a life," he said through clenched teeth. The dagger fell. Lestrade, bursting through the crowd with constables, seized Elridge and wrenched him away. As the painter was dragged toward the doors, he turned his masked face toward Holmes. "You cannot unmake what has been begun," he spat. The glove was never the end. It was the beginning of immortality. Then he was gone, swallowed by the chaos and the rain outside. Holmes stood motionless for a long moment, breathing heavily. Then he turned to me. Quickly, Watson. We must purge the poison before the paralysis becomes permanent. Hours later, Mrs. Reeve lay resting upon a settee in her townhouse, pale but breathing steadily. Holmes stood by the window, watching the city fade into dawn. The fog thinned at last, the faint gold of sunrise touching the rooftops. She was his muse, Holmes said quietly. His art, his obsession, his downfall. Elridge sought to preserve what he feared to lose: beauty, truth, memory. Yet in doing so, he destroyed them all. I looked at him then, the fatigue in his eyes tempered by something deeper, more thoughtful. And you, Holmes, what do you see in all this? He turned slightly, his face lit by the pale morning. That even genius, untempered by conscience, is merely madness with a finer brush. Outside, the bells of St. Paul's began to toll. Somewhere in the distance, the river whispered its eternal song, carrying away the remnants of a night painted in crimson and deceit. And though Elridge was gone, the faint echo of his words lingered, a shadow in the dawn, a whisper of lies that had danced beneath the mask. The morning after the masquerade dawned gray and heavy, as if London itself mourned what had transpired beneath its glittering chandeliers. The fog hung low over Baker Street, thick as wool, muffling the clip of hooves and the cry of newspaper boys shouting of last night's chaos at the Royal Crescent Hall. Within the quiet walls of our rooms, the air smelled faintly of iodine and smoke. Holmes sat before the fire, a newspaper folded unread beside him, his gaze lost somewhere in the flames. Mrs. Reeve had survived. Thanks to Holmes's swift deduction and my rather frantic administration of antidotes, her life had been drawn back from the edge of stillness. Yet though her pulse beat faintly now, her mind remained shrouded, trapped, it seemed, between sleep and waking. Holmes had visited her that morning at her physician's request, and upon his return he had not spoken a word. Only that silence, cold and calculating, filled the room like a storm waiting to break. At last I set down my teacup. Holmes, what troubles you still? Elridge has been captured. Mrs. Reeve lives. Surely this should mark the end of the case. He did not move at first, then spoke so quietly I barely heard him. You mistake capture for conclusion, Watson. Elridge was not the architect of the entire design. He was a hand, a skilled one, but guided by another will. I frowned. Another? But who? Holmes rose abruptly, the energy in him reigniting like fire catching dry tinder. Consider, my dear fellow. Elridge was brilliant, yes, but his resources were meager. He vanished after the scandal at the Royal Academy, without patronage, without income. Yet he re-emerges not only with funds enough to stage elaborate exhibitions, but with access to rare compounds, Venetian turpentine, mercury salts, materials costly and controlled. Someone financed him, Watson, someone with both wealth and motive. He began to pace, the floorboards creaking softly beneath his measured steps. Furthermore, he was never seen at his exhibitions except behind the mask. He relied on intermediaries, agents who delivered his paintings, corresponded with galleries. Elridge was not acting alone. A chill settled over me. Then the masquerade was never just a performance, and it was a diversion. Holmes's eyes flashed. Exactly. The true author of this crimson tragedy remains in shadow, and Elridge, for all his madness, was merely the actor. The final curtain has not yet fallen, Watson. It has merely been drawn halfway. Before I could respond, a knock came at the door. 3 sharp raps, brisk and precise. Mrs. Hudson admitted Inspector Lestrade, his face pale and drawn. Holmes, he said at once, you'd best come with me. Elridge is dead. Holmes's pipe froze halfway to his lips. Dead? Impossible. He was under guard at Scotland Yard. Was, Lestrade said grimly. Found an hour ago in his cell. No sign of struggle, no wound. The constable swears he never left his post. Holmes's gaze sharpened, his voice like a blade. Poison? Lestrade shook his head. None that we can detect. The prison doctor said his body stiffened unnaturally fast and like a statue. There's something else. We found this. He reached into his coat and produced a folded scrap of parchment. Holmes took it carefully. Upon the paper was drawn a single crimson glove. Beneath it, in neat script, 2 words. Final act. Holmes's expression darkened. He's silencing his accomplices, Watson. One by one. We arrived at Scotland Yard shortly thereafter. The cell was immaculate, its single window barred, its air heavy with the faint metallic tang of oil and pigment. Holmes examined the body with precise, almost surgical detachment. Elridge's face was eerily serene, lips curved in a faint smile, eyes wide and glassy. His skin bore the waxen sheen we had seen before. "The same process," I murmured. "Mercury paralysis." Holmes nodded absently, then crouched by the cot. His fingers brushed against a small residue upon the sheet, a translucent smear that glistened faintly in the light. He lifted it to his nose, inhaled, and frowned. "Not mercury," he said softly. "A newer compound. Something more refined. He has improved the formula." "He?" Lestrade asked. Holmes's gaze was distant. The patron, the unseen conductor. Elridge was only the instrument. He rose, eyes burning with sudden clarity. "Watson, do you recall Mrs. Reeves' late husband's unfinished commission? The one Elridge claimed was forged?" "Yes, a portrait for Lord Ravenshade." "Precisely." Holmes snatched his coat from the rack. "Ravenshade is an old name and one steeped in ambition. A patron of the arts, benefactor of galleries, and yet curiously elusive. He vanished from public life after Reeves' death, withdrawing to his estate in Hampstead. If Elridge had a benefactor, it could only be him." Lestrade groaned. "You think this lord's behind all this devilry?" "I think," Holmes said sharply, "that he never abandoned his pursuit of immortality. He simply changed artists. We set out at once. The ride to Hampstead was long and cold. The sky a bruised gray, the trees skeletal against the horizon. By the time we reached the Ravenshade estate, the first flakes of snow were falling, soft as ash. The great house loomed before us, black stone and iron, its windows lit by a dim, flickering glow. The butler who admitted us was a gaunt, silent man whose eyes never met ours. He led us through a gallery lined with portraits, men and women frozen in impossible realism. Their eyes seemed alive, the texture of their skin too perfect to be paint. I felt a slow dread rising in me as I realized each bore a small plaque. "Preserved by the House of Ravenshade." Holmes halted before one portrait in particular. "Watson," he whispered, "look closely." It was Lord Farnsworth, unmistakable. Yet the date inscribed beneath his likeness was the very day of his death. "Good God," I breathed. "These aren't paintings." "They're—" "Yes," Holmes murmured. "Coated flesh, varnished and sealed. He has turned death into gallery." A voice echoed softly from behind us. "You appreciate my collection, I see." We turned to find Lord Ravenshade himself descending the staircase, tall, elegant, his silver hair gleaming like frost. His smile was that of a man long accustomed to admiration. Holmes bowed slightly. "A remarkable exhibition, my lord, though perhaps not one the Royal Academy would condone." Ravenshade's eyes glittered. "Art transcends morality, Mr. Holmes. It is not bound by the vulgar limits of conscience. Reeve understood that, and Elridge perfected it. They were visionaries, each bringing me closer to eternity." "You murdered them," Holmes said coldly. "I released them," Ravenshade replied. "Their flesh endures, their genius eternalized. And now so shall I." He gestured to a vast draped canvas at the end of the hall. "Behold the culmination of their work, the final curtain." With a flourish, he tore the cloth aside. The figure revealed made my blood run cold. It was Holmes. Or rather, a perfect facsimile. His likeness captured mid-contemplation, the curve of his lips, the steely glint in his eyes. The precision was inhuman. Holmes stared at it in silence, his face unreadable. "So that is your intention." Ravenshade's smile widened. "You, Mr. Holmes, are the final piece into intellect made eternal, the mind preserved at its pinnacle. Elridge failed to capture you in life. I shall do so in art." He raised a small device from his sleeve, a glass injector filled with shimmering silver fluid. Holmes moved faster than thought. His cane lashed out, striking Ravenshade's wrist and sending the injector spinning to the marble floor. It shattered, the mercury-like fluid spilling in a glistening arc. Ravenshade lunged for it, but Holmes was already upon him. The two struggled fiercely, their shadows twisting against the walls alive with painted ghosts. Lestrade and I rushed forward. The butler, now clearly more accomplice than servant, drew a pistol, but my revolver barked first. The shot shattered the chandelier above, raining crystal and flame. The gallery erupted in chaos. When the smoke cleared, Ravenshade lay bound upon the marble floor, his once proud face streaked with the very substance he had worshipped. His skin began to stiffen, the pallor of his flesh deepening to waxen white. Holmes watched in grim silence as the process consumed him. The final irony of a man turned to the art he sought to master. By dawn, the police had cleared the house. The macabre gallery was sealed, its contents destined for destruction. Holmes stood outside in the falling snow, his coat collar turned up, his eyes fixed on the pale light spreading across the city. "The curtain falls at last," I said quietly. He nodded. "And yet, Watson, the tragedy of genius is that it rarely dies with its author. Ambition, obsession, they linger, waiting for another hand to lift the brush." He turned then, the faintest smile touching his lips. "Come, my friend. There is still warmth and tea enough at Baker Street, and perhaps a simpler mystery to cleanse the palate. I find I am suddenly weary of immortality." As we descended the hill, the first rays of morning caught the frozen manor's windows. For a fleeting instant they glimmered like painted glass, the last reflection of a world that had sought to make beauty eternal, and in doing so, had forgotten how to live. The final curtain had fallen, but in its echo the name Sherlock Holmes shone brighter than ever, a living mind untouched by time, and the only truth left standing amidst the ruins of illusion.